In this episode, we'll take a look at the OC LCM215E 21.5-inch 1000 nit field monitor. Now, before we jump into this, I just want to say, first of all, this is a budget-priced, professional-level field monitor. This is not for people that are on a tight budget and want to spend maybe $150 on a monitor. If that's what you're looking for, you're dismissed. We don't want to waste your time. Let me run through the pros and cons and some of the features really quickly. First of all, this is a 21.5-inch 1080p 1000 nit monitor. So it's really an HD panel, and it is super bright, so you can use it outdoors without any problems. Now, I want to be clear about this. It is not an HDR monitor. HDR requires some other things. This is high brightness, which means you can turn up the brightness when you're working outdoors, so you can still see things even with direct sunlight. It is an 8-bit panel, so it does have 8 bits per channel. It is not a 10-bit monitor. The monitor can support a variety of different color spaces and also a variety of different LUTs. What I mean by that, first of all, it can support Rec. 709, of course, but it also can do DCI-P3 or Rec. 2020 SDR, which means it's not an HDR monitor. I'd be a little bit skeptical that it can actually produce the entire color gamut for DCI-P3 or Rec. 2020, but it does have those modes. So if you need to emulate it a little bit, if you're going to be shooting for those modes, it does have that option. In addition to that, it does have the ability to convert log footage from a variety of different cameras built in, and you can also apply 4 custom LUTs. So if you want to apply some sort of custom LUT for the particular look you're going for, you can do that as well. Now, we were able to measure the color accuracy of the Rec. 709 mode using an X-Rite i1 Display Pro, and what we found was that the average delta E was less than 2, it was actually 1.4, which means that overall this monitor was able to represent the colors from Rec. 709 very effectively. So it did have one outlier color, a kind of a blue cyan, that was a little bit higher, but everything else was less than 2. So overall, pretty good in the color accuracy department. In terms of signal inputs, you can come in via SDI or HDMI, and it can support up to 2048 by 1080 at 60 frames per second. So it does not support a 4K or UHD input. You do have to send it an HD signal. In terms of inputs and outputs, you do have 2 3G SDI inputs, 2 3G SDI outputs, so you can pass through the signal, and then you also have 1 HDMI input. The native contrast ratio of the monitor is 1000 to 1. And then you can power it a variety of different ways. You can power it via AC, 100 to 240 volts, so you can use it pretty much anywhere in the world. You can also power it via DC at 12 to 17.5 volts, 5 amps, using a Cine battery plate or any other sort of DC power supply that can supply in that range. Interestingly, there's also some DC power outputs. First of all, there's a 2-pin 12-volt 1.5 amp output, and there's also 2 USB-A ports that can supply 5 volts. In terms of power consumption, it will use up to 70 watts max. Now, the build is interesting. It does have a metal back and a plastic battery plate, and the front face is actually plastic as well. So I was hoping for metal all around, but we did get metal in the back, and I think the frame is really quite sturdy. It also comes with a C-stand adapter, so if you want to place it on a C-stand on set or wherever you're shooting in your studio, it's all set to do that. You don't have to buy a separate adapter, which is nice. It does also come with the metal feet that allow you to put it on a table if you're interested in doing that instead. It also comes with this semi-hard sun hood, which is really nice. It can be removed if you don't want it indoors, and if you do need it outdoors, you can attach it here with these kind of snaps on the back of the case. Now again, because it's a high bright monitor, you typically are not going to need that even outdoors, unless you're working in some really extreme sunlight that's basically sunlight straight at the screen. An interesting, unique feature on this monitor is that you can actually display 2 separate inputs at the same time. So if you have 2 separate inputs, 2 separate cameras, for example, you can display both of them either side by side or one as a picture-in-picture. There is an Ethernet port on the back, so you can connect with another computer on that same network and control the entire menu from a browser. For those shooting anamorphic, it does have an anamorphic D-squeeze option, and you also have frame markers. So if you're going to be shooting in a different aspect ratio than 16:9, you can actually also see that on the screen. As a professional field monitor, this of course also includes all the exposure and focus tools you might expect. So we have waveforms, vector scopes, false color, zebra, and focus assist, and they all seem to work nicely. The monitor can also display closed captions or time code if your input signal supplies those. You can flip the picture horizontally if you need to do that. It does also have speakers, and you have full control over the volume. It does have a fan with on and off control, which is really nice from my point of view. If you're pushing really high brightnesses, you may need to turn that fan on. That makes sense. But in cases, for example, when you're working in studio, especially as a live stream monitor, which is one of my main use cases for this, if you have it in the exact same room that you're live streaming from, you don't want a bunch of noise introduced. And in this case, you can actually turn that fan off, especially because you're in studio. You generally are not going to need to push the brightness really high, and so the fan isn't really needed. Let's run through a few cons really quickly. First of all, there is a 14 millisecond latency, which is to say that from the time the input signal comes in, it's 14 milliseconds before it's displayed on the screen. You can see a demonstration here to see what that looks like in practical terms. What are the implications of this? In a lot of cases, it just really doesn't matter. For live streaming, for example, for me, it just doesn't make a difference. That's not a problem. If you're trying to use this as a focus monitor, for a focus puller, I think you can still use it for focus pulling if you're doing something that doesn't have a lot of action in it. If you're doing an action movie, probably not the right monitor. You probably want something a little bit quicker. But for certainly the things I'm working on, mostly corporate videos, then this is going to be just fine. As I mentioned before, the case, the front part of the case is plastic as opposed to metal. I would have liked to see a full metal case, especially at this price point, but it does have plastic on the front. Now, the metal frame on the back seems very sturdy, so I think it'll be okay. If you dropped it on the front, though, I think you could probably crack that case pretty easily. And then the final thing I want to talk about are the blacks. So it's an LCD panel, and the blacks are kind of milky. So you're not going to get that super deep, dark black that you might get from an OLED display, just so you're aware. And while the color accuracy is good, those blacks are kind of lifted a fair bit. So something important to keep in mind. Now, I think for me, my frame of reference for a monitor this size is I do have an Atomos Sumo, which is, I realize, not just a monitor. It is also a recorder, can record to ProRes or to any of the DNX HD types of codecs. So obviously this doesn't have that recording capability, but what this does have is $200 less on the price and also the ability to turn off the fan. And that's the interesting thing, is that the Sumo, while I find it a super useful tool, if I wanted to use it for live streaming, it's too noisy. The fans, it has actually 2 fans in it that are running constantly, and it's just too noisy to have in the same room. So it's totally impractical in those circumstances. So for me, I'm more likely to put the OC to use on a production set versus the Atomos. Let me just talk a little bit about my use cases for it. So I've had the monitor for 3 or 4 weeks now, 4, maybe 5 weeks. But my main use case is, first of all, as a live stream multi-view monitor. So it works really nicely for that. It's a nice size. In live streaming, if you try to put multi-view on something like a 7-inch monitor, it's just too small. 21.5 inches is just about right. It's also really useful as a teleprompter, which is exactly what I'm using it for right now. So it's large enough that I can clearly see it, and it just works really nicely for that. Now, where is this different from a $200 LCD monitor from Amazon? I think the main differences are you're going to get all the tools and the types of inputs that you need and the ability to power it via Cine battery. It does come with a Cine battery of your choice, either V-mount or Anton Bauer gold mount. And in addition to that, it has the focus and exposure tools that you need when you're using it as a production field monitor as well. So those are the kind of things you're not going to get in a $200 LCD monitor from Amazon. So if all you need is an HDMI monitor and you're just using it for live streams, probably a $200 Amazon monitor is going to be just fine for you. But if you're going to be using it in professional types of settings where you need SDI inputs, where you may also need the flexibility of also having an HDMI input with the ability to display from 2 separate cameras at the same time with all of the exposure and focus assist tools, then it's something like this that you'd want to look at. So overall, there's a look at the OC LCM 215E. I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave those down below. And if you've not already subscribed, make sure you do that. And we'll be sure to get you more great videos on how to improve your lighting and sound for video. Talk to you soon.